This is an interview at the Avala Sr. Residence, Albany. It is the 12th of May, 2006, approximately 9:30 a.m. Interviewers are Wayne Clark and Mike Russert. Could you give me your full name, date of birth, and place of birth, please?
My name is David George Keough, K-E-O-U-G-H, born February 16, 1923, in New York City.
Okay. What was your educational background prior to entering service?
Well, grammar school and technical high school in Yonkers, New York.
All right. Do you remember where you were when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
I was sitting in my Cub Master's kitchen having coffee with him and going over the next week's program, and the announcement came over the radio.
Do you remember how you felt when you heard about that?
Well, I had already been signed up for the draft, so I felt a certain inevitability coming. But then after that, we just sat around waiting, listening to the details of the broadcast, talking about it.
Did you enlist or were you drafted?
I was conscripted, meaning that I was signed up for the draft, and when my number was called, I was asked to join the SED, which is Special Engineering Detachment of the Manhattan Engineering District.
What was that called? SED?
SED, Special Engineering Detachment.
Now you were assigned to this unit?
Well, I had worked for Columbia University as a civilian, as a laboratory technician. And prior to World War II, it was known as the National Research Development under the National Defense Act. And all of those fellows who worked there who were under 26 were subject to induction. So once I was offered an opportunity to go with them, instead of going into the regular army, I elected to go with them. I should say they selected me, I didn't elect them. They said, this is your number.
Now, where did you enter service?
Grand Central Terminal, then Camp Upton, and Camp Claiborne, Louisiana.
Now, did you have to go through regular basic training?
I had to take combat engineering training for 13 weeks. But it was cut short from 13 weeks down to about 5 weeks because the staff at Columbia were short technicians. And they didn't, unfortunately, they didn't rotate them. They took us all 5 of us at once. And they left the university short technicians, so the university asked them to be speeded up. So we were cut from the 13 weeks.
Now, what did you do as a technician?
Generally set up laboratory equipment, maintain it, keep the readings on it, pressure and vacuum pressures, check it for leaks, do machinery work, carpentry work, miscellaneous maintenance work around the laboratory.
It sounds pretty technically sophisticated.
Well, we were instructed by the professors and the doctors and the adults. Realistically, we were still teenagers. I had gained a lot of experience having previously worked for the Boy Scouts and the YMCA and gone to a technical high school, so that I had a pretty good feeling for tools and equipment.
Now, how long did you, what was your workday like?
Well, when I was still a civilian, you're speaking about while I was...
Either as a civilian and then how it had to change when you went into the military aspect of it.
When I was a civilian, it was basically an 8 to 5 job.
Mhm.
When I was in the military, there were no hours. You got no overtime.
Mhm.
So the only thing that really changed was the fact that I was in the military and wore drug tags.
Did you wear a uniform?
Well, that's a funny story. Initially, when we first came back from Camp Claiborne, we were instructed to get in civilian clothes and to pass as students going to Columbia. Then I guess it was 4 or 5 months later, they ordered us back into uniform. And the funny part was that one time I was in a local bar with my friends in my civilian clothes, and I was approached by an MP and asked for identification, and I had been given instructions that in the event I ever was approached, I was to say nothing except to identify myself and give my Army serial number and report to Captain L.L. Grosjean. I remember his name to this day. So I sat in the Yonkers police station waiting for Captain L.L. Grosjean to show up. During the 6 hours I waited there, I had all sorts of visions of going into jail.
Now, did you work for the same people?
The same people, yes.
Okay.
Dr. Dunning and his staff at 120th Street and Broadway.
Were any of them in the military, or they were strictly civilians?
No, they were strictly associated with Columbia University.
Okay. And at night when you went home, did you go home to barracks, or did you stay at your house?
I had, since there was no facilities, I was on rations and quarters. And so I had a kind of a funny arrangement. During the weekdays, I stayed at 605 West 112th Street, in New York City with a couple of friends. And then during the weekends, I went back to Yonkers, where I had lived.
Mhm.
And stayed there.
Now, were your parents aware of what you were doing?
Oh, my folks were both dead.
Oh, okay.
They had deceased by many years before
Mhm.
that. So I was living with friends and foster parents. They were not aware of what I was doing, no. They were under the impression that I was going to school at Columbia until the uniform arrangement showed them that I was actually in the Army. And my dog tags showed I was in the Army.
Now, what rank were you at that point?
At that point, I was a private.
Okay.
I got my first promotion to a Tech 5, I think, some 6 months later. And then my second promotion, when I moved out to New Mexico, I received that in New Mexico.
Now, when did you go to New Mexico? Do you remember approximately?
Well, I spent 6 months in New York, so it would be December of 43 until, say, May of 44 at Columbia. And then from May 44 on to my discharge in May of 46 at Los Alamos.
Now, how did your duties change at all? How did things change when you went to Los Alamos?
Well, when I was at university, I did mostly laboratory work and some procurement work, getting tools and getting materials and so forth. When I got to Los Alamos, they found out that they needed my procurement skills more than the laboratory skills. So I was assigned to purchasing. And then as time went by, I got to be purchasing more and more specialized equipment, items that had never been made before, items where the inventor and the producer had to talk to each other, but I was acted as the liaison between the inventor and the producer.
Now, did you realize what the Manhattan Project was?
No, I had the foggiest idea. Their security system was very simple. You given to know what you needed to know to do the job. And it was understood there'd be no free interchange beyond that. So when you're working in the laboratory, you did your pumps and you did your compressors and you did your tool work and you did your lathe work, but you didn't know the overall purpose for which it was going.
Did you know if you were being exposed to anything radioactive or anything?
No, had no idea. The closest thing I ever came was I was lifting some heavy equipment at Columbia and I got a collapsed lung. And they were very concerned, but I didn't know why, other than they were concerned for me. But I didn't know that until much, much later that they might have been concerned with the gaseous diffusion system we were working on.
Did any of the men you worked with, did anyone ever talk about, gee, what are we working on, or what's going on here, or anything?
No, ironically enough, there was a sort of understanding that do what you needed to do and they'll be satisfied. That was seemed to be the attitude.
Now, did you work under any of the top-name physicists that worked there at all, or did you know who they were?
At Columbia I worked under John R. Dunning, who was a Nobel Prize winner, and Clark Williams, who is a doctor of physics. There weren't many people in the physics line in those days. There were few and far between. Plenty of mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, and chemical engineers, but very few people in the physics group.
How about out at Los Alamos?
Well, I got Los Alamos was different in that some of the people there, I didn't know this until later, operated under fictitious names in order to protect their identity. And I was their son's scoutmaster. So I would be talking to a kid, well, let's call him Johnson, and his name might really have been somebody from the University of Chicago or University of Los Angeles, California. So I was dealing with some famous people, but I didn't know that at the time because their sons had assigned names. It wasn't until the war was over that I found out that their true identities.
Now, when the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you had no idea that you had been working on something connected with this at all? Or?
Well, when the first bomb went off down at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we knew because we had already found out from the test explosion at Alamogordo some 3 weeks prior what it was that we were doing. However, we still didn't know that it was a bomb because there was another item of security they introduced, and that was the testing of composition B explosive. It was a conventional explosive used to test the seismographs so that they would have a benchmark when the real one went off. But they didn't tell us that. They just told us we're testing a composition B explosive from Picatinny Arsenal to get seismographic readings.
Now, the equipment then you had was very specialized.
At Los Alamos?
Yes.
Not at Columbia?
No, at Los Alamos.
See, Columbia was really a miniature Oak Ridge. And it was not the same kind of work. One was a pure research job, and the other one was the development of a mechanical bomb. And I think to this day that distinction hasn't been established. But all the while I was at Los Alamos, up to and including the day of the explosion at Alamogordo, I didn't know what we were doing.
Now, when you had time off, you were probably warned not to be.
Were you allowed off the base at all?
I was, because I was a scoutmaster. But you needed special passes to get off of the base. See, Los Alamos was approximately 40 minutes from Santa Fe, and our official address was Santa Fe, New Mexico. But so you lived at Los Alamos, even though you were technically or officially a post office box of Santa Fe.
Did you get much free time off at all?
No. We had a lot of free time at Los Alamos, movies, swimming.
Did you ever have USO shows come in, or?
No.
Probably because of security, I imagine.
Well, what they would do was have the USA go into Santa Fe.
Oh.
And they would bus us down to Santa Fe. But the USOs were never at Los Alamos.
When you were in Los Alamos as the base, did you live in a barracks there?
Yes, yeah, we're full in uniform all the time, fatigues. And the barracks were roughly a quarter-mile away from the technical area. And the sites, there were sites off of Los Alamos. A site, B site, up to Y site. And you'd say, see, I worked in the tech area because I was doing indoor work, office type work. So I worked at the technical area, which was under security guard. Needed passes to get in and out. And I didn't have to go out to the sites where they were actually doing the explosive testing or the other type of work. In fact, I didn't even know the sites existed until the war was over. No
one that you worked with ever even talked about what happened, what was happening?
No, you just talked about your own job. If you had I had roughly 8 guys that I worked with, and we talked about our job, and only what we needed to know about that job. Like if you were procuring an inverter from, say, Bendix Corporation, all you need to do would be to couple the guy who wanted the inverter with Bendix, who was to produce the inverter, and maybe the person who did the typing and the checking of the equipment when it came in. Beyond that, there was no need to discuss it with anybody else, as long as the procurer needed to know what his progress was, and Bendix needed to know what their configurations needed to be. You know how big it had to be. Now all of the sketches and the drawings were hand carried. There was never any need to mail them out or ship them out. That was a no-no.
What about telephone conversations? Was there a lot of that?
I'll tell you a funny story. One time I was up in Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois. and I was going to call my girlfriend, who was now my wife. And I dialed the phone number, and I said, "Hello, Ann, this is," and just then an MP put his hand over the receiver and said, "Sergeant, you know better than that." I wasn't supposed to make any phone calls off base that might indicate my location.
How about letters?
They were
censored?
They were censored. You wrote your letter and you left it open. And after it passed the censor, it was sealed and sent on.
And it never told where you were, or it told
Santa Fe.
Santa Fe, but never anything else?
No Los Alamos.
Mm-hmm.
Everything was Santa Fe.
Mm-hmm.
Now, besides your actual job there, did you have to pull any kind of duties like guard duty or KP or anything like that?
No,
It was just strictly a job.
strictly the job.
Now, what was the food like there? You must have had
His
fairly good
mess
food.
hall food,
Was it just...
but good,
Mhm.
good, yeah. And you could eat pretty much any time you wanted. Yeah. Anytime. There was a regular lunch and supper break. But you didn't have to follow that. You could, whenever it was convenient. The job was the important thing.
So the place was probably running 24
Around
hours
the
a
clock.
day. Yeah.
Around the clock.
Now, were your officers scientists, or...
Well, there were two groups at Los Alamos. There was a civilian group, basically coming from industry and the universities, and the military, a special engineer detachment. They call it the SED. So what was the question?
Who were you accountable to, military officers or the civilian scientists?
While I was in the technical area, I was accountable to the civilians.
Okay.
However, there was an intermix between the civilians and the military at the higher rank. For example, in there's a note from Commander Bradbury, who later became the director of Los Alamos Laboratories. He was the military commander. How he fitted in with Oppenheimer, I don't really know, but Oppenheimer was in charge of civilians. And basically I reported to civilians while I was on the job. Took my cue from them. Once I was out the tech area, I was under the SED. Took my orders from them.
So the SED was out at Los Alamos?
Yes, along with the civilians.
Okay.
Civilians had their housing area, and the military had their housing area.
Were you allowed to, like, off-duty fraternize with the civilians?
No, only for my scout work.
Uh-huh.
See, I was both the Cub Master and the Scout Master there, so I had quite a few. I have to be careful how I say this because I became Scout Master after the war was over, but while I was still at Los Alamos. In other words, the war was over in 45, and I stayed at Los Alamos until May of 46. I was Cub Master during the period while the war was on, as well as when the war was over. But Scout Master, after Commander Bradbury left, I filled his slot.
Okay.
So dealing with the civilians was a different situation during the war versus after the war. During the war, all your socializing was with your own guys, the military friends that you'd made and so forth. The socializing with the civilian staff wasn't necessary because it didn't take in your working relationship as well as your social relationship. So there was no need to, and therefore it wasn't done. It just seemed natural. There was nothing forced about it. I'm quite sure that if I had developed a friendship with some of the civilian fathers more than the acquaintanceship that scouting would involve. It wouldn't have been interfered with. But there wasn't any incentive to do it or any need to do it.
Now, where did the civilians live? Did they have separate compound, or?
Well, the civilians of the more, let's say, sensitive nature stayed on the base in a private housing section, which was built for them. The ones less sensitive, like the mechanics and so forth, lived off base, and pretty much they were hired from the local towns of Lamy and El Pandadoro, I can't remember the name of it, and Santa Fe. They were bussed in every day. But just those with sensitive security requirements stayed on base in a civilian section.
Is there any one person that impressed you more than others that you worked with either at Columbia or Los Alamos? Persons that stand out that you worked with, or?
Not at the time. I mean, I wasn't impressed with anything other than the fact that they were so dedicated to their work. They seemed to be at it 9, 10, 15 hours a day. 6-day, 7-day weeks didn't bother them at all. And I was happy to make them happy. Because realistically, I was still a teenager. I just past my teens. So I hadn't gotten over the aura of adulthood yet.
Later on, in retrospect, how did you feel about working on this project?
Oh, I was
you
very,
realized what it was.
I was very proud of the fact that I had been involved. In fact, I took a job after I got out of the Army. I took a job for the University of California at Sandia in Albuquerque, and worked for the Atomic Energy Commission from 1946 to 1950. So
what did you do for them?
Well, that's another story. Sandia was located in Albuquerque, and it was roughly 50 miles from Los Alamos. And the University of California, which had the Los Alamos contract, wanted to give up any more bomb development work and work on pure science. So Sandia was established for bomb development and mechanical improvement and so forth. So the work I did there was more logistical than it was procurement. The difference being that at Los Alamos we were just trying to just develop ones and twos, and at Sandia they were trying to manufacture more units than one or two. And of course the work at Los Alamos and Sandia both were top secret. And there were no numbers discussed, and here again security was tight. My security went from confidential to top secret when I went to Sandia.
Okay. All right, I guess. Is there anything else you want to add?
Well, other than the fact that I had a lot of fun when I was, particularly in 45 to 46, just before the war was over and I was getting out. with the Scouts, both the Boy Scouts and the Cub Scouts. And I had less work to do for the technical aspect of the job, because Los Alamos rather was breaking down. The people were all going home, back to their universities and back to their jobs, back to their General Electrics and back to their Westinghouse and Alice Chalmers and so forth. And there's less and less staff every day. It became very noticeable. I think we had a staff of about 1,000 people, technical staff of about 1,000 people during the height of 45, the early 45. And by the time I left in 46, if there were 100, there were a lot. So I had a great deal of fun, and I was able to relax a little bit with the kids and take them out on trips and exploring and camping and so forth.
Now, you were always active after the war? Were you always active with the Boy Scouts?
Up until I moved. I moved back to New York in 1950. I thought I was going to be transferred from Sandia to New York and take a contract with the Atomic Energy Commission. And I actually had the job. But Harry Truman laid off all of the new hires in 1951, shortly after he took office. And I was considered a new hire because I was going from the University of California to the Atomic Energy Commission. So they dropped me as a new hire.
When were you discharged?
In May of 46.
Now I know you. Did you ever use the 5220 club at all? It seemed like you kept being employed, so.
No, I didn't. I was familiar with it, and there was a period when I could have taken advantage of it between the time I lost my AEC job and the time I went to work for Ebasco. I was roaming around, hunting around, looking for jobs. Nobody needed my experience, and I couldn't discuss it then because, see, technically when we were let go from the Army and from Sandia, we were under a 7-year security mandate, which effectively said that you couldn't leave the country for 7 years. You had to report your job changes and keep security of the Manhattan District advised where you were.
So you couldn't put on a job resume where you'd been and what you did, in a way?
Well, you could, but not the work you did.
Oh, okay, yeah. Did you ever make use of the GI Bill?
No, I never did.
How about, did you join any veterans organizations?
American Legion. But I wasn't very active in it. I was signed up when I left New Mexico. I let it go for a while. And then when I moved to New York, when the kids were growing up, I joined the American Legion at the Albany post. I didn't join the local posts, which would have been either Yonkers or Putnam Lake.
Is there anyone that you stayed in contact that you were in service with?
For a very short while, the 3 sergeants that I made friends with at Los Alamos, I stayed in touch with for about 6 months. And then they moved and I lost touch with them.
With the units you were in must have been very small. Did they ever have any kind of reunions or anything like that?
I had a reunion would have been the 50th year of Los Alamos. And it was a reunion of the whole of the Los Alamos, just not the SED, but the whole.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So I went out to that. And I made, by the way, when I was at Sandia, I made a friend with a guy by the name of Don Schuster. And he's since passed away, but his wife and my wife have been good friends and have been very good friends for the past 60 years. We still talk to each other on the phone and write to each other.
When you went back to the reunion, were there still a lot of people that you remembered, or they remembered you? Or?
No, when you're at Los Alamos, you're in a very confined group. Only the people you need to work with. I knew a little bit more than the few that I needed to work with because of my scouting associations.
Yeah.
But when I was at Los Alamos for the reunion, there might have been, 1,000 people. That's now wives and husbands and so forth. And, but I only knew maybe a dozen of them. And most of the civilians who I had worked with in a liaison position as a procurement agent, I didn't get to see at all. I didn't even know if they were there. I would have had some fun too, because bear in mind, some of them were under fictitious names.
Oh, yeah.
How do you think your time in the service and then working when this project changed or had an effect on your life?
Well, if it weren't for that, I wouldn't have gotten the job with Ebasco, Electric Bond and Share Company, which is an international construction company specializing in electrical generation in outside countries such as Spain and Israel, and water salination plants like in Egypt. I wouldn't have been able to handle that job if it wasn't for my experience with the military. And the same way with Duracell. When I worked for Duracell in liaison and procurement and logistics, a lot of the experience I gained at Los Alamos and Sandia and Columbia, I was able to put to use at Duracell. I spent 25 years at Duracell.
Okay. All right, well, thank you very much for your interview.
Very good. I'm sorry I took so much of your time.